Emily Dickinson. She had a brother and a sister. And this photo represents her. It is her, in fact. It's a daguerreotype, an early photo. If you would like information from this screen, I invite you to stop the video and copy down what you would like to remember. However, it's not important that you learn every detail on this screen. It seems to me it's good to know that Emily Dickinson was from Amherst, Massachusetts, and that she lived in her family home all of her life. Her father's household was a place of books and learning, and she was able to use the library and read about many different areas of knowledge. She came to love poetry, admired Keats and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, was influenced by the religious poetry of the 17th century and the Bible and the hymn writing of Isaac Watts, and was familiar with theological positions of her family members and of, theological books. Only 7 or so of her poems were published during her lifetime, but at least 1,800 poems were written by Dickinson. A bird came down the walk. He did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw. And then he drank a dew from a convenient grass, and then hopped sideways to the wall to let a beetle pass. He glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all around. They'd looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head. Like one in danger cautious, I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers and rowed him softer home. Then oars divide the ocean, too silver for a seam, or butterflies off banks of noon leap, plashless as they swim. So it might be good to make a pause and to try and answer these questions about the poem. Looking at the first stanza of the poem, we understand that the poem is in iambic trimeter for the most part, and you can see where the accents fall in this screen. It seemed good to show you one of the major influences for Dickinson's poetry. Isaac Watts was a hymn writer, and he published books and books of hymns. No doubt Dickinson knew some of these hymns. Let me just read the first stanza here. The man is ever blessed who shuns the sinner's ways, among their counsels never stands, nor takes the scorner's place. You see something quite similar in the rhythm of this hymn with Dickinson's poem. This is the Dickinson homestead in Amherst. Emily Dickinson's room had a window that looked out over the cemetery, the town cemetery, quite visible from her bedroom, and the room where, she continued to dwell during her lifetime. So she was called the recluse by some of her critics, but she was quite informed about events of her day. She was aware of the American Civil War. She read periodicals. She was involved in neighborhood activities, and she won some prizes for baking. She would give people gifts. She was involved with intellectual conversation, aware of what was going on. She's one of the major American poets of all times and is quite responsible, along with Walt Whitman, for giving American poetry its unique voice. So this is, in the bottom left of the screen, the other photo that is now believed to be Emily Dickinson. This is quite recently established, in fact, and it's thought that it must be Dickinson herself. So with 1800 manuscripts to get into print after her death, it was quite a difficult moment because a number of different people felt that they should be the ones to sort through the work. There was competition between Mabel Loomis Todd, who was her brother's mistress, Lavinia Dickinson, who was her sister, and Susan Gilbert, who was Austen's wife. And to complicate matters further, all three of these people felt they were close enough, and that they should be able to do it. For some critics, it's thought that perhaps Susan Gilbert was even a love interest of Emily Dickinson. So, in 1951, the complete poems, as they were known at the time, were edited by Johnson, and that became a definitive edition for close to 50 years until the new edition by Franklin came out. It's important to know that because, well, it's important to know that. You don't have to memorize it. But the Johnson edition gave Emily Dickinson's poems numbers along with titles. Dickinson never put a title in her poems, and so people would take the first line of the poem and make that the title, which is fine. But to sort through the poems, Johnson gave them an order and a numbering, and it's quite difficult, perhaps, to establish chronological order for certain of the poems, but for others it's maybe not as hard because they were sewn into little notebooks that Dickinson made herself and copied out, in a clean copy in these little notebooks. So there's been a different ordering of the poems in the Franklin edition and a different numbering, so to speak. So it's important to know that this is the case. People in France have been quite interested in Dickinson in the past, and there are two excellent translations that are easily available to you. You can find them in the library. Well, it's not Halloween, of course, in the month of January, but I thought this illustration would give you a little bit of humor for the poem that is to come, because it seems to me that you need more than one poem of Dickinson to get a good idea about her. The poem, A Bird Came Down the Walk, is an amazing poem, as we'll see together. But this poem also is amazing, and so it's good to know more than one, I think. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun, or rather he passed us. The dews dew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling in the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So if we have a quick moment to think about this poem, for some vocabulary, you can see the top line there. But what about the stanzas? You have 6 stanzas here, and the syllabic structure continues. Although normally we should talk more about alternating tetrameters and trimeters as the rhythm of the poem. There's a passage of time in the seasons, perhaps representing the various stages of life from youth to old age. A personification of death as a suitor. The clothing of stanza 4 resembles a kind of wedding dress. So the suitor, the romantic fellow taking you out for a date, drives you to a home where you might dwell after being married, but it turns out that, in the final stanza, the horses' heads were turned toward eternity. It's a grave. It's not a home. Or it is a home, but it's a grave at the same time. It's quite an amazing poem. A flip surprise at the end makes you want to reread it. So again, this is the recently found photo of Dickinson as an older woman. And there's that younger portrait.